An Analysis of Considerable Speck by Robert Frost. The poem seems at first obvious, but there's a great deal going on beneath the surface. On the surface, it sounds like Robert Frost is making observations about a bug that is crawling around on the page on which he is writing. As with any of Frost's poems, it is never safe to assume that the narrator is Frost. In this case, however, the subject matter indicates a much closer connection than most. In any event, the narrator of the story is a writer who is watching a bug crawl across his page of writing. That is the superficial reading of the poem. However, the poem is full of double meanings. Even the title, A Considerable Speck, has two meanings. On the one hand, considerable means significant. On the other hand, considerable means capable of considering. Frost indicates both meanings in the poem. The main double meaning in the poem is the central analogy of the poem. In this analogy, the narrator represents God, and the speck, or tiny bug, represents man. Frost takes up this theme in detail in his poem, The Lesson for Today, where he writes, "Space ails us moderns. We are sick with space. Its contemplations make us out as small as a brief epidemic of microbes that in a good glass may be seen to crawl the patina of this, the least of globes. But have we there the advantage after all? You are belittled into vilest worms, God hardly tolerated with his feet." In that poem, Frost compares man's insignificance with respect to space in the modern world, and God in medieval times. In this poem, he uses the analogy for a different purpose, however. This poem is about God's love for man and his respect for his free will. The seventh line, "This was no dust speck by my breathing blown," is a direct reference to the biblical creation of Adam in Genesis. In chapter 2, verse 7 of Genesis, we read, "Then the Lord formed man of dust from the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life." In this line, Frost is asserting the free will of man, independent of his intervention. This is further confirmed in the next two lines, but unmistakably a living mite, with inclinations it could call its own. The next few lines of the poem describe the action of the bug, racing around on the page and even rejecting God's word, the Bible, at one point, with loathing, for again it turned to fly. At this point, Frost is intentionally associating the writing with the Bible. The rejection of it is another indication of free will. This portion concludes with an acknowledgement of the speck's free will. Plainly with an intelligence I dealt. In the next section, the bug expresses his fear of God and death, but finally resigns himself to death as he cowers down to accept whatever God accords him of fate. The next section begins with the narrator deriding the modern communist movement. "I have none of the tender-than-thou collectivistic regimenting love with which the modern world is being swept." As far as poetry goes, those lines are some of the ugliest ever written, but the sound is meant to convey the awful staleness of life within the communist state, and Frost expresses it perfectly. Frost contrasts those three lines with the narrator's genuine feelings of compassion in the next three lines. "But this poor microscopic item now, since it was nothing I knew evil of, I let it lie there till I hope it slept." The narrator's compassion is first expressed earlier in the poem, in lines 4 through 6, where he initially thought to kill the bug, "and I so idly poised my pen in air, to stop it with a period of ink, when something strange about it made me think." This statement about stopping the bug with a period of ink is another instance of a double meaning. A period means a punctuation mark, and it also means a period of time. The second meaning is a reference to the Bible and the flood that wiped out almost all of humanity. The period of ink refers to the 40 days of the flood that occurred in the story of Noah. Before we look at the last four lines, I want to briefly look at the structure of the poem. The poem is composed of lines of iambic pentameter. This means that there are 5 feet per line, with each foot containing an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Frost does deviate from this slightly to create certain effects, but mostly the poem is iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter gives the poem a weighty feel, and it indicates that Frost intends this poem to be serious, but the presence of rhyme indicates that the poem is not tragic, as it is when he uses unrhymed blank verse. The next thing to consider is the rhyme scheme. This poem has to have the wildest rhyme scheme of any poem, and that is significant. Sometimes the last 4 lines of the poem are split off, but if we take the entire poem as one verse, the rhyme scheme looks like this. It seems hopeless to make any sense of that rhyme scheme. However, the chaos is a clue, as are the ordered couplets at the beginning and end of the poem. The chaos in the poem begins in the 7th line, where the narrator realizes that the speck is alive and has intelligence, just after he has declared that he would not intervene to stop it with a period of ink. So the first 6 lines of the poem represent the 6 days of creation in the Bible. The 7th line is where God gives up control to man. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." From the 7th line onward, man takes control of creation, and it becomes a product of God and man, just as the sheet contains the narrator's written words and the speck's actions. The actions come to a climax in the line where the speck resigns himself to death and cowers down. Despite the speck's resignation, the narrator, as God, does not intervene and kill it, but leaves it to a natural death. This is the end of the world. The last 4 lines return to the beginning couplet structure. Man is gone, and all that is left is God and His creation. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. The final 4 lines can be broken into 2 parts that highlight the 2 main themes of free will and love. The first couplet acknowledges man's intelligence and free will. The second couplet describes God's love of man and the appreciation of his accomplishments. This last couplet brings to mind God's observation in Genesis after creation is complete. And God saw everything that He made, and behold, it was very good. Frost hints at this goodness earlier when he writes, "Since it was nothing I knew evil of." There is still more to say about this poem, which I will add to our lesson page at zoax.net for those who are interested in a more detailed analysis.